Welcome to the Time Bubble Podcast, the only podcast where the guests get to travel in time. I'm your host, Jason Ayres, and with me this week is my fellow podcaster, Danny Doran. Welcome, Danny.
Hello, Jason.
Great to have you with us. Now, I've been on your podcast and very much enjoyed it, so tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, the Infinite Jigsaw podcast is so named to allude to kind of lifelong learning and working stuff out, and also making mistakes. You know, anyone that does a jigsaw puzzle will tell you they rarely ever get the correct piece on the first go or the second go or the third. So the podcast, if I'm honest, it's my way to make up for squandering my formal education, really, and not being able to now revisit it. So I've constructed my own kind of informal university, and I've been fortunate enough to have 50 episodes in, some really great guests and very eminent scholarly people, and I mean never to graduate from the Infinite Jigsaw, hence the infinite aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I find it very interesting. You talk a lot about sense making on your podcast, which I think is really interesting because there's so much going on in the world, particularly recently, where we can often feel that what's going on around us just doesn't make any sense. And I love the way that you sort of dissect that with people and try to come to some conclusions.
Well, it's a lifelong thing, isn't it? Sense making. And my vain hope is that one day, many years from now, my son picks it up and carries on with the podcast and with the learning. So it's up to me to build the foundations of this informal university and set these foundations with as much integrity as my miserable character can muster, I guess.
Well, it's you don't come across as miserable. It always sounds good, but interesting when you talk about your son, actually, because I'm trying to encourage my son to show an interest in my series of books, and he is reading some of them because I like the idea that I'm creating this body of work, and that after I'm gone, perhaps it could continue.
Yes.
For example, I mean, we talked a couple of weeks ago on the podcast about Ian Fleming. Now, he died in 1964 after writing about 12 to 14 Bond books and very early into the film franchise. But other people obviously have come on and written new films and books since. I love the idea that my son might actually do that. So, yeah.
Me too.
But we can but hope. But you've got to get them off YouTube. That's the problem.
Yeah, good luck doing that.
Yeah. So in terms of what we're going to do today, I'm guessing you've probably heard a few episodes. So you know. I
have. I've listened to them all. They're brilliant.
Excellent. Thank you. That you're the second person in a row that said that. So obviously it's going down well. Okay. So what we do in the first half of the podcast is invite you to imagine that you're stepping into the time bubble and traveling back into past days of your life. So where would you like to go first?
Well, Jason, if I may, firstly, I just kind of like to set the theme of my choices today. Because thinking back over your life is like this ponderous exercise. It's this exercise in both regret and satisfaction. That's why I'm so glad you've come up with this idea for the podcast, because it gives people the opportunity to look back over the events of their life and sort of study which of their good and bad behaviours and their choices have influenced and formed their present circumstances. Because it's true that some things, they just happen to a person regardless of how you act in the moment. But I think for the most part, it's how we choose to move in the world that shapes our present. So I've tried to select 3 days that I can safely say led me, for better or worse, into my here and now. And I'll tell you if I do anything differently on those days, given the gift of the time bubble. So the first day I'd like to revisit is a Saturday in the summer of 1986.
How old would you have been then?
I'm 10 years old. I'm 10 years old. Now, my dad has moved us from Luton Town to a village 8 miles north called Clophill, Clophill. And this would be the place where I spent my formative years from about age 5 to 19. And Clophill is this ancient village. It appears in the Domesday Book. And it's got this ruined church atop a hill. And it's the only church in the country whose altar doesn't face east. All churches are oriented eastward.
Oh, wow. I never knew that.
Yeah, it's something to do with the second coming. I don't think we're too sure, but I'm no expert. So anyway,
Okay.
old St Mary the Virgin of Clophill faces west, which is why the Druids used to love going up there, and all manner of occultists and things like that. It's very famous for that. But on this Saturday morning, my brother happens to be on leave from the Navy with his wife, who incidentally was a Wren and worked at Checkers for Mrs Thatcher, who was the PM at the time. And they're visiting. They decide to take me shopping with them to the Luton Arndale. Yeah, so very exciting news for 10-year-old Danny, because my brother always buys me something cool from the shops on these excursions. And also when he left after every leave visit home, he'd always leave me a massive pile of change under the pillow, which was equally cool. So they take me shopping.
So a bit like the Tooth Fairy. But...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but with 10s and 20s and a pile of coppers.
Oh, very nice. Yeah.
So they take me shopping, and I remember the car journey there, and my brother's wife paying me attention, asking me questions about school and whatever I was doing. I can remember parking the car at the multi-story, which me and my cousin called the Curly Whirly car park. You know, those curly multi-stories that popped up everywhere in the 70s. Yeah. I remember we were in my dad's company car, which is a metallic green silver Cavalier SRI, and the registration was B219XMJ. Sadly, I remember all of my dad's old registrations. And then I can remember like steaming around the toy shop. And this toy shop was an old independent chain called Zodiac Toys. Did you have that?
I do remember that, yeah.
Yeah, they was actually founded by the Maynards wine gum people, whose sweet shops were doing that well. So they branched out into toys.
Yeah, I think we may have had one in Oxford. It rings a bell.
They were all over the place there. I think they went away in the 90s. But anyway, on that occasion, I think I chose off of one of these high shelves a mock dashboard of a car, like a little steering wheel, indicators and a gear stick and a horn in the middle and things like that. And it had 4 plungers on either corner, so you could stick it to the back of the passenger seat, pretend you were driving a car. It was bloody brilliant.
This reminds me of the opening titles of The Simpsons, where you got Maggie Simpson's doing that in the car, isn't she?
That's it. That's exactly it. Yeah. That's exactly it. And I remember getting that in a big box, and then we walked through the Arndale and down the alley to the Mcdonald's. And this was in the era of styrofoam burger containers. You remember them?
Yes, littering everywhere.
Well, I mean, there's still littering now, but
there is.
I know the styrofoam wasn't supposed to be remotely ecologically friendly, but it did steam the burgers properly, so you didn't get a cold burger. And the chips in those days were properly salted, and they've reduced the salt now. So it was a superior product, but inferior in terms of perhaps its ecologically friendly aspects. But this was a massive treat anyway to me, because my dad would only take me to McDonald's on the proviso that after he bought me the grub, I would then be sat with an unsuspecting family whilst he went off and did shopping. He did this on several occasions, to my chagrin. You know, I actually could have chosen to go back to the day where he sat me with a somewhat surprised but clearly charitable family of 4 in one of those formed plastic booths, you know, the horseshoe-shaped booths.
Yes, I remember.
He perched me on the end of one of these and announced to the table that he'd be back before I'd finish my food. Not at all taken into account if this would coincide when this family had finished their food and they wanted to leave. But what I remember about that day, if that wasn't bad enough, not long after he left, I reached across the table and knocked over the bloody milkshake of the teenage daughter who was sitting opposite. It was a terrible, oops indeed. It was this, I can remember it clearly, like a thick 80s style strawberry milkshake, like an unwelcome bright pink gravy oozing over this girl's fries. It was horrible. People don't know embarrassment.
I'm imagining this in like a movie scene where it's in slow motion. Your arm goes out and you hit the cup and you see it slowly going over and somebody's going, no.
Yeah, that was me inside screaming out. Honestly, it was so embarrassing. Until you've experienced this kind of adolescent calamity, you don't know what embarrassment is. It was horrible. Anyway, on this occasion, and like normal people, my brother and his missus took me to McDonald's. They actually sat with me and ate, which was a great relief. And then we did whatever they needed to do and got the car from the multi-story and drove home with me doing like a dramatic turn as co-pilot in the back on my new Dash. But when we got through the front door at home, the mood changed. I remember my mum sitting on the sofa in floods of tears and my dad comforting her. And it transpired that soon after we'd left to go shopping, some friends had called for me to go out to play. And you've got to remember that parents were nowhere near as insulating or watchful over their kids in the 80s. And we lived next door to this big wood and this big sandstone quarry, which is really great for exploring. But these four lads had clearly explored a bit too far into the edifice of the sandstone. And I guess they were digging a camp or a cave, like a Stig of the Dump style cave. And it collapsed on them. And it trapped two of them under the weight of a few tons of this crumbling sandstone. Two lads escaped and then ran back to fetch their mums, who returned to the scene and tried frantically and desperately to dig their little boys out of this sandful with their bare hands, but to no avail. The two lads were dead. Their names were Jamie and Matthew, I remember, and the two surviving boys were their respective brothers. So had I been at home that day, it's possible that I would have gone out to explore and explored a bit too far and met my end in those tragic circumstances. So that's a day that is so memorable, but a day that I would not want to change for myself, albeit in the mind that there are several people still in this world that would dearly love to alter the outcome of that day.
Oh my gosh, that's awful. And it does, as a parent, and my son's called Jamie as well, and I've tried to give my kids a 1980s style upbringing, and I haven't wrapped them in cotton wool, and they do go off. And Jamie is 12, and he's been going out at 10 o'clock some days and not coming back till 4 or 5 o'clock, and he's out on his bike, and you never stop worrying that something might happen. But I still prefer him to be out there rather than sitting on the sofa watching YouTube all day. It's a very difficult thing, isn't it?
Yeah, we've got sons the same age, haven't we?
Yeah.
And it's really difficult. I mean, I was a lot younger then, and 10 years old, and the other two lads when they were 7 and 8. So, but kids did go out exploring earlier then, especially if they have brothers to go with, older friends.
It just goes to show that any seemingly random and tiny insignificant decision where you might go or what you might do one day could alter your life completely, possibly, or even end it, which is quite a horrific thing to contemplate. But I suppose we all have that at the back of our mind every day. Nobody is ever 100% safe, whatever you're doing.
No, sometimes things just happen to you. It's a bit of a roulette wheel.
Yeah. Do you have any more to say?
Sorry, that's a bit grim.
Yeah, no, that's right. We've had other grim tales, believe me. Have you any more to add on that, or do you want to move on to another day?
Yeah, let's move on to the second day.
Okay,
we'll fast forward to 1992. I'm 16 and I'm a dickhead at 16, no doubt.
We were all dickheads at 16. That's fine.
But after some early promise at junior school, where I was moved up a year, I'd finished all the work apparently, which I find it hard to believe now because I can't ever remember being good at maths my entire school career. And I do remember being really impressed and bemused by those who got maths. And I know you were quite good at maths in your early years, weren't you?
Well, I was, but I didn't like it. That's the thing. I was very good at sort of statistics, but not all maths. That was the thing. I could, anything to do with statistics and probability, I could just do it instantly. But when we got some of the other stuff, the trigonometry and the equations, once they started bringing letters in as well as numbers, I found that a lot more difficult. So I didn't like maths, but I was always pushed into it because I was good at parts of it. So, yeah.
Well, I don't want to sound envious because envy is a sin, but when I say good for you, there is a tint of envy in there because I'd like to be better at getting numbers. But nevertheless, my mum was really proud when I brought that letter home that I was moved up here. I remember that. And then let's just say that the promise of high achievement, it didn't last for long for one reason or another. And I suspect actually that the academic demise is or was down to my developing this sense of the creative urge, which in its effect, it kind of lessened my capabilities to concentrate on the things that I had little interest in, but coupled with the appeal of things that I did have an interest in, but hardly any remarkable talent or encouragement. So I was caught in between two worlds, and I floated through school propelled by a real flippant attitude, and I couldn't settle properly into this spread of subject learning that modern schooling demands of kids. You know, whether or not those who write the curriculum think that schooling is supposed to be a kind of, what would you say, a kind of polymath manufacturing plant where in goes a blank leaf of paper and out comes a working encyclopedia. I don't know.
No, I do think you have this comprehensive range of subjects, don't you, when you're at 11, say, and you're still doing it up to 16, and then when it comes to A levels and university, you can specialise. But perhaps we should allow people to specialise earlier. If there's an area that you're clearly never going to excel in or do anything within your career, is it worth? I mean, in my case, it was Latin. So the only O level that I failed, and I spent years doing Latin, which really, although I'm a writer, I consider to be a complete waste of time. I'd rather have been doing something a bit more practical.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's much to be said to identifying aptitude and allowing maximum time to develop in specific areas of interest, as opposed to young minds being spread over all these subjects. Like, what did Bilbo Baggins say? Like butter over too much bread.
Yeah.
You know,
is it interesting? I'm going to hark back to an earlier podcast with Flora B when we were talking about Gerald Durrell, the naturalist, and I've been watching a series about him. It was on ITV some time ago, a drama about them living in Corfu, and so Gerald Durrell, he's obsessed with animals and biology and botany. And he's got all these animals that he's bringing in the house and keeping, and he's about 12 or 13, and his mother is desperately attempting to get him some schooling. And every single person who comes to try and educate him, if it's nothing to do with animals or biology, he simply does not want to know. And they're tearing their hair out, and but he doesn't want to know. He just wants to do his animals. And he comes on to have a successful career as a naturalist and writing books and television and keeping animals, and hugely successful. It was all he ever wanted to do. So you question, well, did he need that schooling they were trying to force upon him? Possibly not. But then again, now we're so much more ingrained into the system. You wouldn't have that freedom that he had out there on Corfu when he was sort of 12, 13 years old.
No, it's not even in the hands of the academic staff to be able to give that license to a young person that shows aptitude in one direction or another. It's banned from up high.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
yeah,
I'm not achieving much at school, and I ended up being dishonorably discharged towards the end. So when it came to college, I had no idea at all what course to take up. So on the advice of my dad, who was a civil engineer, he was in civil engineering, in that September, I began this diploma in engineering, and I was crap. I was crap. Not once in my young life had I shown any interest or any aptitude for measuring things using calipers or boring holes into bits of metal on a lathe. And
it's not something that sounds particularly exciting.
You need to have an interest in it.
Yeah.
And some people, and thank God for engineers, don't get me wrong.
Oh, yeah.
But the tutor didn't like me either, because I was an insolent little twonk, and those are his actual words.
Surely not.
Yeah. His name was Hugh, and I better not say it because he might still be about, but I do remember his name. Nice chap. I mean, I was an insolent little twonk, so he was absolutely correct. But to add to this, I found out by mixing with other students in the refectory and that some of them were taking courses in things like photography and film studies. And some of them were actually watching films and then talking about them all day at school. I couldn't believe this was an option. I mustn't have read the prospectus properly, because I could not believe it. So I missed out on that one big time, but it was too late to switch. So I jumped off that course, and I got myself a little job working in a kitchen until the next year came around. And I did another course in computing. I wasn't very good at that either. It was when COBOL was around and Pascal and stuff like that. And
yeah, I remember those.
Yeah, I couldn't get on with that either. Met some lovely people, had a good laugh. So with lack of sort of what to do with myself, my mum, and the better advice of my mum, we went to the Royal Navy offices in Northampton. You've got to remember my brother was in the Royal Navy, and I had this interview and I was booked on a test. So I rock up a few days later to sit this exam, and I can remember the room. I can remember the other young people around me, and I was presented with this paper, which to my dismay was at least half maths questions. And I can recall thinking, what is the fascination with maths?
Yeah.
It seemed to me that if you weren't any good at numbers, you weren't any good for anything. So I muddled through this test, and they collected them up, and I was the first one called into the office. In retrospect, now I know why, to get the results from this very smart man with deep voice in Navy uniform. And he said, yeah, Danny, you've failed the test. You scored fine on everything but the maths. And if you want to be an engineer in the forces, you must improve your maths. And I said, sir, I do not want to be an engineer. And he was like, then why did you request to take the engineer's exam? And I said, I didn't, sir. I want to be a comms operator working with radar and such like. And he said, oh, you'd have aced that test, completely aced it. There's clearly been a mix-up, Danny, but that's okay. You can come back in 6 months and try again. So tragedy, unbelievable, and felt completely dejected. I went home, and the officer called me at home to see if I was okay, which was a nice touch from him. And he said that during my interview, his notes read that I was studying for a diploma in engineering at college. So it was assumed that I would carry on with this, but in the forces. So there you have it. If I could go back to that interview, I would make it clear that I did not want to be a bloody engineer, and that I would have ended up joining the Navy in 1992, sailed the seven seas, and there you have it.
Okay, so you didn't go back 6 months later?
No, the rave generation was starting, and 6 months is a long time when you're 16.
Yeah, I gave up on maths in the end. Going back to what you were saying about people doing other courses, I did 2 terms, so 2/3 of a year of maths A level, and I hated it so much I dropped out of that and picked up communication studies, which was like you were talking, it was all to do with film and TV, and I caught up with that and I did pass that A level, and it was a far more enjoyable thing to do.
It sounds it, and I would have preferred that.
So you didn't go into the Navy. I wonder what life would have been like. I suppose you've thought about that many times, but as we often say, these things steer us to where we eventually end up, which moves us on to day number 3.
Yeah. So the third day, which I'd like to revisit, happens in the month of February. I remember this well, and in the year 2004. After failing this test for the Navy, I went on to have loads of different jobs. I moved up and down the country. I lived on Mallorca for a while. But then an old friend of mine who had actually got his arse in gear and bought himself a round the world ticket ended up in Australia. Now, lots of people of our era, Jason, that did this, didn't they? Did the travelling thing and went to Australia. But I don't know about you. Did it ever occur to you to do this? It didn't occur to me.
I did go to Australia, but not so much in the backpacking sense. So I took about a month of sort of traveling around the world and stopping for about a week in various places. And I spent a week in New Zealand, and I spent a week in Australia, where I stayed in Sydney, and I travelled around a bit in New South Wales, but I didn't do the whole, trekking around the whole country. So I would say I semi did it. So
that will do.
yeah.
Well, I'm just about to go on to explain something that's even less intrepid than that.
Yeah.
I never seemed to have the situation before that where I could save enough cash to go to do these things. So when my mate asked me if I could join him in Australia at this time, and I was, as I say, really disgruntled with life. All the jobs I had were unfulfilling. The rave scene had given way to super clubs. All my mates were back from uni and they were beginning careers and earning decent money. So I was generally disgruntled, and I wanted to be the opposite of disgruntled, whatever that. I wanted to be gruntled, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. What is the opposite of disgruntled?
I
Yeah.
don't know. Antonym of
Yeah.
disgruntled. We'll go with gruntled.
Yeah, gruntled. I've never heard that before, but perhaps that is a word. We'll have to look it up afterwards.
Let's hope so. Yeah, so with the help of my mum, God bless my mum, I found myself on this plane, 27 hours with one stop at Colombo, Sri Lanka, where they refueled the plane but wouldn't let us off. So it was a real longie. I finally get there, all excited. My mate meets me at Sydney Airport and takes me on the ferry to where he's pitched up. It's a coastal town on the northern beaches. It's called Manly. Have you ever heard of it?
Manly
Yes.
Beach. I went there. It's I think I liked it better than Bondi Beach. Actually, it was a nicer place, even though Bondi is sort of more famous.
Manly is, I think it's been a bit more explored now and built up.
Yeah.
It was a bit of a hidden gem still.
Yeah. Well, it was 2004 when I was there. Did you say that was the year you went?
Yeah.
So we were there more or less at the same time.
Yeah. That's mad. There's a few people that I come across in my area that say, oh, yeah, I was in Australia then.
Yeah.
But this is actually February 2003 when I landed. It's 1 year prior to the day, which I want to revisit.
Okay.
So I've come from this English winter to an Australian summer. I've swapped out this grey despair for this sunshine, this sunny delight. And I have just fallen in love with this experience. And I'm living in digs with young people who are travelling. I'm making fast friends. I'm enjoying an outdoor lifestyle, beers and beaches and the barbies and all of that jazz. And actually, in those early days of the trip, I used to have this recurring nightmare that I was still in England, and I'd wake up all panicky and all gutted. I realised it was in Oz. I had this huge sense of relief. So I had an amazing year in Manly, and I got a job. I was doing removals for a company called Man in His Van. I've still got the T-shirt actually, and I'd see 2 different places in Sydney every day. You know, the pick up and the drop off. It was a real good laugh. It kept me fit. My mate, by this time, had gone back to England, and I was living in this small guest house, which had no live-in manager. So the owner had me do the meet and greets, give people their keys, change light bulbs, and give me a bit of reduced rent, which was brilliant. And then he bought another guest house and asked me if I'd want to be the live-in manager full time to this guest house right on the beach in Manly. So that was even better, you know.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful.
It was great. I got lucky. Life was good. It was comfortable. I had loads of friends. I was far less of a dickhead than ever. I met lots of cool and arty, creative people. But I will admit I'd nested there in the Manly trap. So in February 2004, the day comes around and I've got money because I get paid for the job. I've got no real rental expenses. I get the odd tip from the guests, and I built up this stash of cash. But I wasn't really having any notable traveling experience. I was living normally, you know, just a normal life cosseted by this beach. And this group of lads from Coventry that I got to know had been working locally and saving up to go off for an proper explore around Thailand, Vietnam and Bali and that. And they had this intrepid adventure all planned out. And I got in close with them. So they asked me if I'd like to go with them, you know, leave Manly and do some proper traveling, some proper exploring, some actual travel. And I mulled it over and looked at what I had set up here in Manly, there in Manly. And I got worried about what I would encounter in these strange Southeast Asian countries. And I just turned down their offer. Now, I did stay in Manly for another year. It was good. It was all right. But it was nowhere near as exciting and new and thrilling as had been the first 12 months. So it's an easy one, really. If if I could go back, I'd grow a pair of bollocks and I'd take up the Cov boys and their offer and go do some proper travelling.
Yeah, yeah. I kind of wish I'd done the same because I was fairly free at that time. Yeah, I was just in the process of leaving Nielsen after 14 or 15 years, which, funnily enough, you were talking about recurring nightmare of being back in Britain. I think sometimes we do have these things because I have, so it's 18 years now since I left Nielsen. Still regularly at night, I have this recurring dream where I'm in an alternate universe where I never left Nielsen. And I'm still there in the office and my old boss is asking me to do stuff. And there's been a whole years have gone by in my dream where I've been there. And it's a completely separate plot line of the way my life could have gone. And it often makes me think about the alternate universe thing, which I've explored in my books. And I do wonder if there's an alternate universe out there where I never went off to Australia, New Zealand. I stayed at Nielsen and I was still working there now, 32 years after joining. And it's amazing how elaborate this other world is. And I don't know if you find this as well. When you are in this other dream world, you never question it. It always seems like that is the real world. I'm never thinking, hang on, I don't work at Nielsen anymore. I left there 18 years. I never think that in the dream. It's fact.
Yeah.
It's bizarre.
Yeah, everything is so starkly realistic in a dream. Rarely do you have one of those dreams where you wake up within the dream, and they're the best ones because for those few moments, you get to control the dreamscape. Yeah,
it's a fascinating thing. Dreams. Could talk about that for 4 hours. So presumably after that, you stayed for a year and then came home.
Yeah.
Are there any issues with visas? Like, is it like you've got a certain amount of time there and then you've got to come back, or is it okay if you've got a
that
job?
Was part of it really. My 2-year visa had expired, but I'd also, from this guest house, I had the opportunity to be sponsored, which I didn't take up in the end. So that was part of my decision making, where I didn't go with the Cov boys. I thought, no, I'm going to stay here and get sponsored and become an Australian, but I didn't even do that. So lost on both fronts.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Which way could things have gone? We'll never know unless we can find a way into that alternate universe where we took the other path.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to move on to the second part of the podcast now. And there's 2 questions in this section, and I usually ask them separately, but a couple of the guests I've had have liked to combine the 2. So I'll probably give you both questions in one go and you can deal with it as you wish. So the first one is, if you could go back in time and spend the day in someone else's shoes, who would you choose? And together or separately with that question, if you could go anywhere in history, where would you go?
I thought about this for long and hard, and I've settled on this paradigm, settled on this kind of alternate reality for myself. And I'd like to, as you say, bundle these 2 questions together and take myself back to 1945. Just for clarification, that's not 7:45. That's the actual year, 1945.
The end of the war.
The end of the war. Now, I'd like to embody an American soldier, a GI, returning home from victory in Europe, having had what must have been the adventure of a lifetime, having had the experience so intense as fighting in World War II and surviving that world drama. Now, many parts of the United States in 1945 were horribly poverty-stricken in modern terms. It was a far different country than it subsequently became. And according to my bit of research, nearly a third of Americans, written down here, nearly a third of Americans lived in poverty, and a third of the country's homes had no running water. 2/5 lacked flushing toilets, and 3/5 lacked central heating. many places that returning soldiers would have gone back to wouldn't have been half as good probably as where they got fed and watered when they were overseas.
Yeah.
But so, as this is my time bubble and I can sort of go where I like, I'm not going to plonk myself in a big city where slum is kind of a byword for the working class home in those days. I'm going to slum it in a different way. I'm off to Big Sur in California, and in my American GI's uniform, I'm rocking up at the home of Henry Miller. Now,
okay.
Henry Miller, the author this is.
Yeah.
Now, Miller had his own European adventure in Paris, which he wrote about extensively, and then in Greece with his great friend Lawrence Durrell. And it's just quite incredible that you mentioned his brother Gerald Durrell and Corfu.
Yeah, that is
on the
interesting.
podcast.
It's interesting because I didn't know much about Lawrence Durrell when I started, looking into Gerald, and I didn't realise he had an older brother who was a writer in his own right. And Henry Miller did drop in on them.
They were great friends. They were great friends. He stayed with the Durrells for an extended period.
I'm watching the Durrells, the TV series, which Flora kindly put me onto on BritBox at the moment, and I'm on the third series of 4. Now, I wonder if Henry Miller might turn up as a guest star in the 4th series. I'm wondering now, but I guess I'll find out soon when I get to that episode. But yeah,
I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure about that. But I know they were great friends, and he lived on the island of Corfu with Lawrence, and then Henry decamped back to the States and to Big Sur. Now Big Sur is this rugged stretch off the California central coast. I think it's between Carmel and a place called San Simeon, and it's still quite sparsely populated, but in 1945 it was, even more so. And Miller was known for his hospitality. He was this bon vivant character. He was a magnet for some of the most interesting and creative types of the time. He was one hell of an incredible writer. He was a risk taker in literary terms, Tropic of Cancer being famously or infamously banned for alleged lewd content.
Yes.
And it's this kind of creative person, this kind of, I say what's in my heart and mind. I tell the truth of life, however distasteful. I look for beauty in ugliness. It's these kind of qualities that makes, for me, Henry Miller the go-to guy via the time bubble. I would do everything I could to befriend Henry. I'd soak up his maverick spirit. I'd try to learn the trick of making art, of writing books in this unrelentingly honest fashion. I'd live on the quiet mountains in Big Sur atop this glorious coast, just eating, drinking, discussing, debating, laughing, and I'd write about the war that I'd fought in and survived, and I'd write about what wars mean to a person who lives through them, and how the spiritual exertions of wars affect the subsequent years of that person's life. And I'd bear witness to the birth of a new and improved United States of America and all those cool technological and cultural innovations of the 1950s. And that's what I do, Jason. That's where I go. That's what I do. That's where I'd be with.
Right. Well, there's a couple of things that spring to mind there. Firstly, I haven't read Tropic of Cancer. I tried, but I wasn't allowed. So, I'll explain. So, obviously, Henry Miller's books were very racy for their time, and as you mentioned, they were banned for a time in the States and probably here as well, where we were. Well, we've got a number of authors, haven't we? I know people, when you talk about banned authors, people think of D.H. Lawrence, but Henry Miller. So when I was about 15, I was devouring books from the library like there was no tomorrow. And being 15, I was starting to take an interest, shall we say, in adult relationships, despite being a couple of years away from actually being able to indulge myself in them. And so anything with a little bit of racy content became of interest. But I recall attempting to take a number of books out of the library, and I am pretty sure that Tropic of Cancer, or another one of Henry's books, was one of them. Unfortunately, the library was run by this, I suppose the best word I can use to describe her is Harridan, who I suppose Mary Whitehouse would be a good person to compare her to. She was the classic, librarian that you have at this time, who would shush at the drop of a pin. And she had these great big elaborate glasses.
Were they horn-rimmed? Tell me they were horn-rimmed.
Along the line, not quite Dame Edna Everage style, but not far off. And this big sort of bouffant hairstyle. I guess she must have been about 60, or maybe she was younger, but just dressed older, as a lot of people did in those days. And she saw it as her mission to prevent young minds being corrupted by filthy material, as she probably thought it. And there were a number of occasions I recall attempting to take books out of the library and being told no for that reason. And I am pretty sure that Tropic of Cancer was one of those books.
Surprised she didn't keep the copy in the safe. If she was that frightened it was going to corrupt young minds.
Yeah, I mean, she let me. Other stuff was allowed. I got all the James Bond books out of the library, but I mean, they're not racy. They do just describe certain situations, but that level was acceptable. But Henry Miller was not. And to this day, I have never got round to reading any of them. So maybe I should. People have inspired me through these episodes to go and look things up. So maybe now's the time.
Highly recommended. What can I say? He's written over 100 books, or involved in over 100 publications. I've got about 30 in my meager collection. And I picked one up I didn't have over eBay. I got it home and opened it, and there's an inscription in there from Henry Miller to a friend, and it looks damn authentic, and that cost a £5. So I think I might have got lucky with that one. That's a nice bit of serendipity, given my sort of reverence for the man. That
would be what our friends Mr. Carmichael and Mr. Livesley would call a nice thing.
Yeah, it was a nice thing.
Yeah. So one other thing I was just thinking about when you were talking about that time is that when we think about 20th century American history, there's certain periods that stick in your mind. So we tend to think, the 1930s, we think about depression, and then we think going on to wartime. And then we think about the American dream in the 1950s and California and the Beach Boys and all of that type of thing. But there's quite a gap, isn't there, between, say, the end of the war, 1945, and rock and roll getting going, which we don't really hear much about. That must have been, I don't know, like a sort of recovery period when we still have rationing here. When I think about rock and roll and that whole scene, you tend to think about Bill Haley and people like that, or on Elvis. You sort of think of it kicking off about 1955, but I wonder if the seeds of it were there earlier, maybe even in the late 40s. I don't know.
Yeah, I think doubtless they did a lot of work culturally and politically in those 40s to set up the 50s.
Yeah, I mean, you've certainly come a long way from, how you described 1945 and the end of the war to where we were in 1955, when everything just exploded, really, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, neither of us were there, and neither of us are American, so can't really comment. But one thing that both of us have done is watched a hell of a lot of TV and film over the years. And that's where you get your reference points, really, isn't it? Books here and there, but let's be honest, it's TV and film that English people get their American reference from.
Well, the obvious one, and I've mentioned it on the podcast before, is Back to the Future, where the year they go to is 1955. But there were quite a lot of many other sort of films that reference that era. You've got Grease, and there were quite a few copycat films of Back to the Future that I remember from the 80s. There was another one called Peggy Sue Got Married.
Yeah, with Nicolas Cage.
With Nicolas Cage, yeah.
And a very young-looking Kathleen Turner.
Yeah. There was a lot of interest in that era. So, and I've had a couple of guests on the podcast who've said they wanted to go back to that time. It's one of those things, isn't it? You had to be there.
Yeah, it just seems like the sort of time. I could have picked many times in the present, and I could have speculated on many times in the future to be. I'm sorry, many times in the past and the future. I'm not too sure about the present. I'm not bothered at the moment about going anywhere at this moment in time. But what do you want to do with the time bubble? I'd want to have fun, and
yeah.
I'd want to sit at the feet of people that I revere and respect, who are, just fallible human being who'd probably tell me to piss off when I rocked up at his door, maybe. But nevertheless, you've got to use the time bubble for something that you think is going to give you the best chance of having a good laugh.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, that's brought us more or less to the end. A couple of things before we go. Firstly, where can people find your podcast?
The Infinite Jigsaw podcast is on YouTube. It's over all other platforms. Just type the Infinite Jigsaw podcast in your browser. I'm on Twitter, and it's an arts, culture, and you might say philosophy podcast. And I'm just seeking out interesting people to learn from. That's what I'm doing. And it's been a pleasure being on your podcast, but it's been slightly weird for me because I'm not used to being on this side of the microphone, if that's even a phrase. So quite nerve-wracking, actually, because lack of control, I guess. But I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, you've come across really well. I think it's been great. In terms of seeking out interesting people, I'd just like to say to everyone that listens to this that I'm doing the same. So we've recorded 10 or 11 episodes, and I think it's gone really well. Everyone that's been on here has enjoyed it, but we can only continue, obviously, if we have more guests. So it's a call really to say that anyone can come on here. It's not just for, famous people or I'd like ordinary people. I don't even like to use the word ordinary people because nobody is ordinary. Everybody has tales and stories to tell about their lives, and other people would love to hear them. So if you are a fan of the podcast, just get in touch with me and you can come on.
I hope they do, Jason, mate. It's a really good idea. It's really well presented. It's got some cool music by our talented mutual friend, Michael Livesley, and it will be around as long as you want it to be around, I'm sure.
I hope so, and yours as well. So brilliant. Thank you very much. It's been great having you on today. So enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Cheers, Jason. Ta-ra.
Thanks. Bye.